Once this gleaming coin is took, a bargain is struck.
By hook or by crook, they'll get you into the army.
And when you're with me, all you can drink.
The British army that battled the French through the Iberian Peninsula and smashed them on the field of Waterloo was a tough force of professional soldiers led by arguably the greatest British general of all time. But how were these men recruited? What training did they receive? And did a regiment's county affiliation actually mean anything when it came to recruitment? Well, Redcoat History regular contributor Steve Brown is on the show today to help us to answer all these questions as well as lots more. I started off by asking Steve if recruitment was done centrally like in most modern armies, or did the individual regiments handle recruitment themselves?
It was by and large by regiment, because you have to remember regiments at this time were to a large degree individual fiefdoms administered by the regimental colonels, and the army was a collection of regiments rather than being an entity in itself that just happens to have subsets called regiments. There was a central recruiting depot, and it was based in the south of England, but by and large most regiments detached officers, usually young officers. They also detached senior NCOs and drummers and so on to basically scour the countryside to pick up recruits wherever they could. And an awful lot of regiments, particularly those who were serving overseas, had an 11th company called a recruiting company, which was typically 4 officers, 8 sergeants, 8 corporals, and 8 drummers, basically given the task of scouring the taverns and or other places that they could pick up troops to go around and try and recruit men by fair means and foul.
'Tis a constant amber flow.
Whether they could talk them into it over several gallons of beer or whatever, all methods were justifiable, but they didn't press gang like the Navy, I hasten to add. This was a time when the small towns, villages, even the large cities of Great Britain were awash with recruiting parties, just constantly looking for, fresh talent, so to speak.
I mean, we're looking at this image there. I know. I think was it the 33rd who were nicknamed the Havercakes because of that.
That's them. Yeah, I think this is actually a reference to that. Yeah, because his facings on his regiment are red, on his uniform are red, so he's more than likely a sergeant of the 33rd, or actually there's no stripes, so possibly just a private of the 30. Well, he's got a crimson sash, so must be an NCO of some sort, trying to pick up troops. And whilst nearly all regiments had secondary titles, which were usually county titles, they actually meant jack in the scheme of things, because regiments picked up men wherever they could get them, and more often than not from their home county. And to give you some idea, the 2nd Battalion of the 11th Foot, which I think was a Devonshire regiment, and the 2nd Battalion of the 44th from Essex were made up of almost entirely of Irishmen.
Right.
By the time of Waterloo, they had almost nobody from Essex or Devon in the ranks. So it was really a matter of catch as catch can, and that didn't really change any time at all between 1793 and 1815.
And I think I'm right in saying, you might correct me here, that about a third of the army in total were Irish. Is that about right, based on your research?
I can guarantee you it is almost exactly right. I've done a number of statistical studies on various regiments looking at their composition, and no matter which way I slice and dice the data, Irish is about 30 to 40% of the rank and file, comes up every time. So yes, it's virtually an established truth.
I'll not have Irish tricks. By God, I will not.
So we've talked about the ranks. What about officers? How did they get their men? You and I have spoken in the past about the purchase system, but on a sort of more basic level, how did the regiments find and train their officers?
I mean, there was always young men of a certain social class queuing up to be in the officer class, and particularly after 1803, an awful lot of these young men came from Ireland, and there are some regiments where more than 50% of the officers came from Ireland, even though they're English county regiments. So they, by and large, were able to fill them. I mean, the recruiting parties did not go around looking for officers. Officers came to the regiments of their own free volition, and officers were able to regiment hop as they saw fit, unlike the men, if they saw a better opportunity somewhere else. So if they were in a regiment that they saw they had a bit of a glass ceiling and they couldn't progress, they were quite free to transfer to another regiment or purchase a higher commission in another regiment and jump across that way. And I feel, although this is supposedly was frowned upon, that there were officers who, when they found out that their regiment was being sent to some unattractive posting, took the opportunity to regiment hop out of their regiment to some regiment that was staying at home, even though that was supposedly not supposed to happen. An awful lot of officers came from the militia, a very large amount, particularly after about 1807, 1808. The reason for it was that it was an attractive proposition. If a militia officer brought 50 recruits with him from his militia regiment, he received a free commission. So it was a free price of entry to bring some guys with you and to come into the army and stop being a weekend warrior and be a full-time warrior. And in fact, some of Wellington's brigadiers in the later years of his Peninsular campaigns came into the army exactly that way.
Moving on, let's look at training then, both for officers and men. We've got on screen here the men being trained in the principles of movement by Colonel David Dundas. Yeah, yes. What can you tell us about, well, briefly about him, but about the sort of training the men would have received and how important Dundas's book was to them?
Well, Dundas was a ramrod straight, very conservative Scotsman, very tall, thin, austere, who was a big fan of the Prussian system as used by Frederick the Great. And he wrote his drill manual in 1788, at the time, probably mostly for his own amusement. But it was adopted by the Duke of York upon becoming Commander-in-Chief in 1795 as the official drill manual of the army. So it suddenly took on a whole new degree of importance, and it became the instrument by which recruits were bashed, drill bashed, I should say, for years to come. And the top right image you see there is new recruits in the depot, and I hasten to add that regiments didn't have fixed depots at this time. They meandered around the countryside, going from barracks to barracks, and even permanent barracks didn't exist around the country until, early 1800s.
Mate, ready! Reason!
But you can see the sergeant majors there drilling, probably under the eye of the adjutant on the right. Recruits wearing their white drill tunics. They don't wear red yet, being put through their paces. It was very rigid, very prescriptive, and it took, I've read, to make a complete soldier about 3 years. It took 6 months of training to get him to be extremely proficient in all of the drill movements, but it took 3 years, and ideally with a bit of campaign, to make the complete soldier. Bottom right, we can see a light infantry regiment doing training, and you can see the sergeant major there with his pace stick and his crimson sash and his white gloves and his 4 stripes and his scarlet jacket, like the officers, not red, putting the riflemen of the 68th through their paces. One of the things that Moore did when he was training down at Shorncliffe with the light infantry troops is he adopted the Royal Navy method that they applied to midshipmen, and the Royal Navy midshipmen were expected to spend a period of time receiving training as landsmen. In other words, running up and down the ropes and learning all the nautical things they had to do as effectively as a private or an ordinary seaman, before they could become a midshipman. And in the light infantry, Moore adopted something of the same approach, where he made junior officers coming into the light infantry regiments don a pack, pick up a musket, and drill with the men. And he would not allow them to stop doing that until they were as proficient in all of that as the men were. Only then could they progress on to start behaving as officers in command. So that was a very interesting technique, and that was quite revolutionary at the time.
Okay, but what about officers in other regiments? Did they receive any serious training, or as gentlemen, was it assumed that they would automatically know their job?
A bit of both. I actually went searching for, within the general orders that were issued by Horse Guard in, I think, 1807, possibly 1806, the page covering the instruction of officers, and what you have up on screen is all the content I could find about how to train officers, and it's very much a statement of intent rather than telling commanding officers how to do it. So it sort of says, commanding officers are responsible for training improvement, and you must, and by this time they must have achieved this. But it tells you nothing about how to actually do it. So it was very catch can again, and very much the domain of the regimental colonel and of the lieutenant colonels commanding the regiments. And one of the constant gripes that I've read in inspection reports from inspecting generals, because regiments were technically inspected twice a year, was the imperfectness of the training of the officers due to the lack of capacity or attentiveness of the commanding officer, etc., etc. So there was no really. I mean, basically, they tried to follow what was in the Dundas drill manual, but that just told you about how to form yourself and march in a line, and how to change formations and that sort of thing. It didn't say how long you're to do it for, how the order should be given, etc., etc. And there were some comical instances that I talk about in my book, Fit to Command, of officers who managed to get their battalions into formations that no one on the drill field could even recognise. And in one case, an officer, a cavalry regiment was forming up on the beach. He managed to get his regiment to wheel out into the sea. So yes, it was an imperfect system. Really, it relied very heavily on the skill and talent of the commanding officer and the regimental colonels, and a really, really good battalion commander will, by and large, be a really, really good trainer. And for example, John Moore, who I've mentioned, was an outstanding trainer, as were the guys who commanded the light infantry regiments, because they were trained by him and they had the same expectations.
But I understand the army could see that this was a problem, and at some point during the war they introduced a training college for young officers. Is that correct? And could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, that was the Royal Military College, which was founded based on a suggestion or recommendation by John Le Marchant, formed in 1800. Originally, it started in the back rooms of the Antelope Inn in High Wycombe, and then it acquired more and more strings to its bow, and it expanded. It included various classes and various intakes, and ultimately became Sandhurst that we know today. I did a bit of a deep dive as to how many officers at Waterloo, as an example, had actually gone to RMC, and about 12% of all British officers serving in the Waterloo campaign, so 1 in 8, had been to the college. About a fifth of those had served actually in the Foot Guards and the 52nd Light Infantry, and about another 29 served on the staff. But those serving on the staff, there were some stellar names in that. You had senior ADCs to a lot of the senior staff officers, and Hill as Corps Commander, and to the Duke of Wellington, of course. You had Wellington's Chief Exploring Officer, and you had Henry Harding as Wellington's liaison officer. So they were holding some important posts. So Waterloo was possibly the first campaign that the fruits of the Royal Military College were starting to be felt. It took a while, and in that sense, Britain was somewhat behind a number of the continental powers in establishing college. But by 1815, it was starting to come good.
And how did attendance at the Royal Military College come about? Did people apply to go to the Royal Military College, or were you, once you joined a regiment, you were assigned by your lieutenant colonel? How did that work?
Well, there was actually two schools. There was the senior school and the junior school. The senior school was really intended for existing serving officers, usually of the rank of captain and above, to go and attend and to learn specifically staff duties, I think mostly. And there were a number of them, and there was a relatively small intake each year. There was also the junior school, where it was intended that prospective junior officers could attend and then pop out of the college and immediately get commissions as ensigns, or a deserving junior officer might be sent there by a commanding officer to participate and then return to the regiment when complete. So it's a bit of both, I believe.
So Steve's books on the British Army of the Napoleonic Wars can be purchased via helion.co.uk, and they'll make a great addition to any library. I'll be back with more incredible stories from British military history soon. In the meantime, please subscribe, comment and watch my other videos like the one on screen now.